Hey guys, in today's video we're going to go over the creation of the 8.4 web endpoint, DLP endpoint, and the combination web DLP endpoint if you have both solutions installed in your environment. As always, please consult the Forcepoint documentation on endpoint creation and installation before watching this video through and using it as your sole source of information for this process. You can find that information by simply going to the Forcepoint support website, going under documentation, make sure you click all documents, and scroll down to endpoint security, and you'll see documentation covering both Forcepoint web security and DLP. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. Just a quick note, if you don't want to sit through the web DLP and the web and DLP portions, what you can do is look at the bottom of this video in the show more portion of YouTube, and you'll see a video index which I'm going to highlight the different times of the video that talk about the different endpoint creation and installation portions. So one time will be web, another will be DLP, and another time in the video will reflect the web and DLP combined endpoint. So keep a lookout for that. All right, so your first step in endpoint creation is obviously to download the endpoint. Where can you get it? The data security endpoint can actually be found in the WebSense directory, and we go into data security, and if we go to clients, you can see that the endpoint package builder is located there. In the web portion, it is actually accessible from the Triton manager. If you go to your hybrid configuration and look at one of the sections, I can't quite remember, I think it's under user identification, you'll see that there is an endpoint deployment box, and if you click through that, you'll be able to view the endpoint files available for download. I prefer using the package builder. It's an executable that's much easier to kind of walk through and select the configurations you want to use. So I prefer using that, and I would recommend using that if you can. But because we roll out different updates to our endpoint package builder and our endpoints themselves, I usually recommend only using this if you are installing a Forcepoint solution that has been just released. So if 8.4 had just come out and I was going to install that, then I'd be comfortable with just going in and grabbing the endpoint package builder from the actual directory itself. However, to always stay as up to date as possible, what I recommend doing is going onto our support site, go to our Forcepoint downloads portion, okay, just like this. Go to all downloads, and we'll go to endpoint security. And if you click on Forcepoint DLP endpoint, don't worry, the package builder contains the endpoint creation portions necessary to create both web and DLP endpoints. Just go to that DLP endpoint link, and you'll see the Forcepoint endpoint available for download here. Okay, so I've already actually downloaded that endpoint, and I've placed it onto my Forcepoint manager server. It's important that when building the data loss prevention endpoint, you have a few prerequisites completed before installing it or before running the package builder. One, make sure you have DLP completely installed and configured on your system. Two, make sure any kind of custom DLP endpoint block pages that you want displayed are already configured in the XML file, and you can find instructions for that by searching our support site for custom DLP endpoint messages. So once you kind of ensure that both of those are done, you want to let's go ahead and unpack the package builder. There it goes. All right, so that's unpacked. here's the package builder folder that I'm going to go ahead and find my executable in and run it. You always want to right-click and run as administrator. Again, whenever you log into your Forcepoint Manager server, make sure you're logged in with the service account that you've installed all your Forcepoint components with. All right, let's go ahead and right-click, run as admin. It's going to go ahead and bring me to my package builder screen. So you're going to have a few options here. The first endpoint I'm going to create is the Forcepoint Web Security Direct Connect endpoint. And that's actually the options that are already pre-checked. So we're going to go ahead with the creation of the Direct Connect endpoint. I'm not going to explain the differences between the endpoints in this video. However, please consult your Forcepoint sales engineer or account team, and they can give you some guidance on the differences between those. It's also all contained in our documentation online. So we'll go ahead and kick that off. Go to next. I'm only installing this on 64-bit machines. I do want to have an uninstall password set. This password prevents an unauthorized user from uninstalling the endpoint when it's pushed to their machines. You also set up this anti-tampering password on the Forcepoint Security Manager itself within either the hybrid settings or your data loss prevention endpoint settings. Once the endpoints synchronize with the Forcepoint Manager server, the password that you have placed into the manager server for the endpoint uninstall will be pushed down to the endpoints. This password that I'm entering here is just something to use in the interim until the endpoint actually reaches back to the manager to synchronize that anti-tampering password. All right, so I've placed my password in there. In my case, because this is a lab, I don't want to protect my installation directory from modification. However, in every other enterprise environment, you absolutely do want to check this option because you don't want your users going into the folder and tampering with the different configuration files and whatnot. So let's go ahead and hit next. Where do I want to install it? Default location, just makes things easy. WS context value. So this is actually the value that associates the endpoint to your hybrid or cloud web account. You can find the information on how to retrieve your WS context value from the endpoint installation manual. I'm going to go ahead and enter that, and I'm just going to cut out on the recording real quick while I enter it, and then once it's entered, I'm going to hit next. All right, I've entered my WS context string and hit next. That's set up now, and it brings me to the next portion of the endpoint package builder. And this is my local block page logos. You have the ability to customize this with custom logos as well as messaging around what the block page displays. I'm not going to modify this at all. I'm just going to leave it at defaults and hit next. So where do I want to save that installation package? I'm just going to go ahead and save it to my desktop. And that shouldn't take much time to create. All right, and it's created. So what I like to do when creating these various packages is actually save them in a directory that's very clearly defined so that it's easy to identify which package basically is what. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my spot where I have all my endpoints saved, and you can see I kind of have them sorted out fairly neatly. And this is going to be my Direct Connect endpoint that I built for my hybrid environment. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and place this into here. And I'm just going to rename this so I know what kind of endpoint it is and the version it was created on. Let's see. I'll actually do it right here and call it Direct Connect Endpoint 84. That way I know this is the Direct Connect endpoint that I created for version 8.4, and as I create more, this naming schema will keep the versions in the correct order, or in alphabetical order. Alright, so that endpoint is created. Now we're going to go ahead and create the cloud web security endpoint. And I know in the package builder, and you'll see this in a second, in some places it actually says that if I run it, it actually only calls out hybrid as what you're creating this particular endpoint for. But just note that you can create cloud web security endpoints using this package builder as well. It's not strictly for hybrid. So I can create another Direct Connect endpoint for my cloud instance by going through the same steps as before. And I'm going to go through these very quick. Oh, I think I messed that one up. Default location. And I'm going to use my cloud's WS context value. So that's the only difference here, is which WS context you use. So if I go ahead and place that in there, I'm going to go. Okay, I placed my cloud web security instances WS context string in there. And now I'm going to, again, move on through this step. I don't want to customize anything in the block pages. My save location, again, I'm going to make it my desktop. Finish. Alright, so that's saved. It was very quick. I'm going to go ahead and save this in that folder structure that I was showing you earlier. So my cloud endpoint, drag that in here. And this is going to be called Direct Connect Endpoint 84. There we go. Now I can easily identify that when I come in and know what kind of endpoint it is and what version it was created on. Alright, now let's go ahead and create a combination web security and DLP endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and just throw that endpoint in the garbage there since I have already saved it in this folder structure. Now I'm going to go ahead and open my package builder again. There we go. Alright, so you'll see if I go ahead and check Forcepoint DLP endpoint, I have the option to now create a combined endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and do Forcepoint DLP and Web Security Endpoint. In this instance, I'm actually going to use the Proxy Connect endpoint as my combined endpoint. So there's lots of variations. I could do a DLP endpoint in combination with a Direct Connect, DLP in combination with Proxy, but I usually prefer to use the Proxy Connect endpoint unless there's a specific reason why I need to use Direct Connect endpoint. So we'll go ahead and hit Next. I want to create a 64-bit package. We're going to specify our anti-tampering password. Again, this is also placed in the Forcepoint Manager under both the web security hybrid settings as well as the DLP endpoint settings. You simply put this password in here. to account for the interim where after you've deployed your endpoint, it hasn't performed a sync with the Forcepoint Forcepoint manager or the DLP endpoint managers yet. So we'll go ahead and I'm not going to do that. Again, in enterprise environments, you absolutely want to protect the installation directory. This is just a lab environment, so I'm choosing not to. Oops. Better make sure my passwords match. Do this again. I'm going to use a default installation directory. Okay, now this is asking me where my endpoints need to reach out to get their initial policy and profile settings. Generally, if you're deploying in the same regional location, it's okay to leave your manager's address in here. However, if you've already set up your DLP infrastructure, and that's including your DLP endpoint management servers or endpoint agent servers in different regions, what you likely want to do is create different packages that will initially reach out to the DLP endpoint server that's local to their region. So for example, if I'm deploying these in, let's say, the central United States, and my manager is located in the central US, I'll create an endpoint package where I have this IP address of my manager as the first point of contact for this endpoint server to get its initial policy and endpoint profile settings. However, if I'm deploying this in, let's say, France, and I have a location in France, and I've already set up an endpoint server in France, what I'll want to do is create another endpoint package where I specify that endpoint server as my server that's in this address box. So that way, my endpoints that I deploy in France are not reaching all the way back to the US to get their initial policy and profile settings. They can simply reach out to their endpoint server that's already located in France. Okay, you also have the option to set up a server that will host automatic endpoint updates. So that way you can pretty simply just throw on new endpoint versions, and your endpoints will automatically update using that local endpoint server. I don't want to do that right now, but for instructions on that, again, refer to the Forcepoint documentation. So we'll go ahead and hit next. User interface mode. So interactive versus stealth mode. Interactive mode allows the end users to be notified when they're violating a corporate DLP policy. It also allows a few other actions, such as a confirmation action, and that's in the case that maybe you don't particularly prevent something from being done, but you want to make sure the end user has a business use case for performing that action. You can prompt the user to confirm and enter a reason as to why they are trying to, let's say, upload this file to X cloud storage service. Interactive allows a lot of that to happen. If you turn interactive mode off and switch to stealth mode, the endpoint icon and all of its visibility is completely invisible to the end user. They won't even know it's installed on the machine. When something is blocked, they will not even get a prompt that it was blocked. It will simply prevent the user from uploading. Usually we encourage our customers to use it in interactive mode because this helps utilize the endpoint as not only an enforcement point but a learning tool for the end users. So now we're going to go ahead and select the installation mode as well. We always want to keep it as full. Very rarely do you do a discovery only endpoint deployment. That's only in cases where you purely want to only perform endpoint discovery. And discovery of sensitive information on the user's or endpoint machines that the endpoint is installed on. So we'll leave that in full mode, interactive mode. All right, now we're getting to the portion that's going to talk about, or that's going to configure the web security piece of this. So this information, the pack file URL, you can leave it as the default setting here, and this is only specific to the Proxy Connect endpoint. If you watched the video before, we installed the Direct Connect endpoint, and all it asked for was our WS context. However, Proxy Connect utilizes a combination of both an enforced pack file setting as well as back-end network stack integration to intercept TCP communication bound for the web. Luckily, this is all done dynamically. You actually never have to modify the pack file manually. It's all controlled through your UI configurations in the Forcepoint manager and is pushed out seamlessly to the endpoints. No user interaction is required. Now, for this particular portion, you'll want to get the pack file string out of your either Triton manager in the web security portion, or in a cloud instance, you'll want to pull it from the policy that you've configured for your cloud users. Again, that is located in the endpoint documentation on how to retrieve this. I'm not going to go over that here. However, I am going to enter that and then hit next. But before I do that, let me explain this little option right here. This is called Allow Users to Disable Endpoints. So by checking this, what this does is it activates a feature on the endpoint that allows users to right-click and temporarily disable the endpoint. This is great if you have traveling users that sometimes sit behind customers or other businesses that have proxy infrastructures in place where our endpoint is not able to get out of that environment. So if you run into, if you're maybe a consultant and you're traveling to different customers' locations and you're pretty frequently behind their proxy infrastructure and they haven't placed you on a guest network, then sometimes that can cause or be problematic for a proxy-based endpoint in getting out to our cloud for filtering. So this would allow that user to simply right-click on the endpoint icon and temporarily disable it. I like to enable this option just simply because it's another feature I can display in my lab. So we'll go ahead and do that, and I'm going to pause the video real quick, enter my pack file information in. Again, this is located in your web security portion of your Forcepoint manager, or the if you click on a policy in cloud web security, you'll see the pack file information as well. All right, I entered that pack string and I hit next. It brought me to basically this final screen. Where do I want to save the installation package to? And I'm going to go ahead and save it to this desktop. Let's give it a second to create it. It usually takes a bit longer to create the package when you are doing a combined endpoint or when it includes DLP. Web is very quick. So that's created. I'm going to go ahead and save that in my folder structure for my endpoints. Still give this a second. Looks like it's still creating. Okay. Moving that over to the organized folder structure that I kind of have. I'm going to label this appropriately so I know what kind of endpoint it is. So it is a Proxy Connect endpoint and DLP endpoint at version 8.4. Okay. That way I know what kind of combination endpoint it is. All right, now we're going to go ahead and move on to the creation of just a DLP endpoint for version 8.4. Let me go ahead and trash that last package I created. So we're going to go ahead and just run the package builder, run as administrator. All right, and in this case, I am going to just create a Forcepoint DLP endpoint package. So I go ahead and hit next. I'm going to create a 64-bit package. This is for my Windows box. I'm going to enter the anti-tampering password. This password is only used for the interim time between when it takes for you to deploy the endpoint out to a client and the time it takes for the endpoint to communicate back to the endpoint server to pull back the anti-tampering password that you're going to enter in the DLP endpoint settings on your Forcepoint manager. So this password only takes effect basically in that short time period or that gap of time where the endpoint is out there and it hasn't yet communicated back to the Forcepoint manager or Forcepoint DLP server or endpoint server. Make sure you document these passwords as you put them in. Don't ever put in a random password and not document it anywhere. Make sure you remember what these passwords are that you're placing, because you will need them to uninstall the endpoint. You always, in an enterprise environment, want to protect the installation directory from modification or deletion. In my case, I'm not going to, because this is a lab environment, so I'm going to go ahead and uncheck this. But in all other cases, please keep this box checked. All right, I like that default location for the installation. So when you are specifying a server to provide the endpoint with its initial policy and profile settings, you generally want to pick the Forcepoint endpoint server that is regionally close to where you're deploying the endpoints. So for example, if I'm deploying endpoints to my to the central United States, and I have an endpoint server located in Chicago. Let's pretend this is that endpoint, or this is that endpoint server that's located in Chicago. I would leave this address in the Forcepoint or in the configuration right here. What that's doing is it's saying, hey, endpoints, when you're deployed, the first server I want you to reach out to get your initial configuration information from is this server I have here. After they've already done their initial configuration, they no longer require, or they'll actually pull down the servers that you've programmed into the endpoint profiles to communicate to. So this is just for that very first communication with the endpoint server to pull down those very first policy and profile settings. So make sure if you are deploying these, let's say, to a location in another region, like out, let's say you're deploying to France, and you were deploying your endpoints there, you'd want to make sure you had a Forcepoint DLP endpoint server deployed in France, and that you use that IP address here when you build the package for the endpoints you're deploying in France. That way, the first server they reach out to is that endpoint server in France to get their policy and profile settings, and they're not reaching all the way back to the United States server to have to get that information. Right? In my case, my endpoints are being deployed locally, so I'm using my local server, and my endpoint server happens to be my Triton or my Forcepoint management server as well. I don't recommend using the Forcepoint manager server as an endpoint server if you're more than, I would say, 250, 500 clients. It's always best practice to have kind of a dedicated endpoint server in your environment if you're doing a large endpoint deployment. All right, so that looks good. Just to give a quick explanation of this setting right here, it allows you to automatically push updates to the DLP endpoints using a server within your environment. So if I check this box, I can basically create an HTTP accessible server that utilizes this address, or the one that you specify. So if I check that, I would enter the address here. And whenever a new endpoint version comes out, you can simply drag that new endpoint version or that new package that you've created onto the update server, and all your endpoints will know to reach out to that server to check for updated endpoints. So it just allows for much easier, basically automatic updating of endpoints within your environment, but still a controlled update so that you control what version they're updating to. More information on this is contained in the endpoint documentation. Please check it out if this is something you're interested in. Go ahead and hit next. So interactive versus stealth mode. Interactive mode basically allows users to see the reasoning behind files potentially being blocked or confirmed when the endpoint interacts with their transaction. For example, if I'm an end user and I'm attempting to copy a file to a hosted cloud service and it's blocked, because my endpoint was designed or configured to be in interactive mode, I'll get a little pop-up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen that will say this transaction has been blocked because of X and Y reason. Or if maybe you weren't deciding to block that transaction and you just wanted the end user to confirm why they're doing this particular action, like copying a file to a cloud storage service provider, it maybe pops up a confirmation dialog and says, why we've identified you attempting to copy this file, please provide a business justification as to why. And the user can select a business justification. If we put the endpoint in stealth mode, all of that goes away. Basically, the endpoint is not visible in the taskbar anywhere, and the end users don't get any kind of notification when they are violating any corporate policy and their actions are being blocked. They'll simply, the transaction will simply just not execute. So we usually encourage our customers to deploy endpoint in interactive mode because not only does it act as a more informative enforcement point, but it also helps kind of bolster user training at the same time by informing them that they're violating policy because they're doing X action. The installation mode, we're going to leave in full. You would only select discovery only if you were purely deploying the endpoint to only do discovery on end user machines. That very rarely happens. If you deploy it in full mode, it will have that capability built in as well. You'll just simply have a full endpoint deployment. So we'll hit next. Now where do we want to save it? I want to save this package to my desktop. Hit OK. We'll let it build that out. All right, the package is created and saved. I'm going to go ahead and go to my folder system and save this endpoint into this folder. And I'm going to give it a unique name, or at least prefix it with something so I can easily identify it. So DLP 8.4. There we go. Nope. Try that again. There it goes. All right, and that's covers the creation of the data loss prevention endpoint for Forcepoint DLP version 8.4. Now, lastly, we're going to go ahead and cover the creation of the Proxy Connect web endpoint only. So we'll go ahead and let me just navigate to and I'm going to create it for my hybrid environment. Again, the steps are the exact same for both the hybrid environment and the cloud web security environment. So I've already created a direct connect endpoint package for my web hybrid environment. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a Proxy Connect endpoint package, Proxy Connect is generally the recommended endpoint to utilize unless there is a specific need to use Direct Connect. Please consult with your Forcepoint SE to kind of understand the differences between the Direct Connect and Proxy Connect endpoints and what the various use cases each addresses are. So let me go ahead and run that package builder as an administrator. Again, I've used the exact same package builder to build all of these various packages in different configurations for my endpoints. So we're going to go ahead and create a Forcepoint web security endpoint using the Proxy Connect endpoint. I'm going to hit next. I'm doing this for a Windows 64-bit package. I'm going to put in my interim anti-tampering password. Okay. And in my case, I'm going to choose not to protect the installation directory. However, in any enterprise or actual business deployment, you absolutely want to protect this installation directory. This prevents users from being able to go into that directory and modify config, binary files, etc. Generally, you want to protect enforcement of the endpoint on the end user's machine, and by exposing this directory to them, they can potentially bypass, get around it, delete important configuration files that are required for the endpoint to run, etc. So always leave this box checked. Go ahead and hit next. Yes, I'm comfortable with the default installation directory being there. All right, so now we need to enter the pack string URL for the endpoint. This can be easily obtained going into your Forcepoint manager, going into your hybrid configuration and user access portion of your configuration. Also, this in the cloud web security piece, if you go into your web security policies and you click on a policy, you will see the pack string URL there as well. The pack string URL is only used for the Proxy Connect endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and populate that in a second and then hit next. But first, let me explain what this little option right here does. Allow users to disable endpoints. Basically does exactly what it says. It allows end users to temporarily disable the endpoint when they're caught behind an environment that has maybe a proxy infrastructure already built in that is not allowing the endpoint to appropriately connect to the Forcepoint cloud web security infrastructure. It's great for addressing use cases like consultant workers who are going out to different enterprises or different businesses, and they're sitting behind the business's proxy environment. Sometimes those proxy environments don't allow the endpoint to communicate out appropriately. If that's the case, the end user can simply right-click on the icon and the endpoint icon that'll be displayed in their taskbar and hit disable. This will allow them to temporarily disable the endpoint while they're at that customer site so they can get their job done. Again, our goal is not to prevent the business, it's to allow as much business as possible to happen as easily as possible while still ensuring good security when necessary. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and allow that option because it's great for a demo environment as well as I'm just using a lab environment, so it's definitely more acceptable here. I'm going to go ahead now and grab that pack file information, enter it here, and hit next. All right, I entered my pack file information, I hit next, and now that's it. Now it's just asking me where I want to install, or where do I want to save the endpoint package that I've created. I'm just going to save it to the desktop, hit OK, and hit finish. All right, that package is saved. Now I want to go ahead and save it to, again, one of those organized folders that I have. So I'll stick to the naming schema here. You can see above it I created the Direct Connect endpoint for 8.4, and this one I'm going to label it Proxy Connect endpoint 8.4. Now something to note, when you create the Proxy Connect endpoints, it's only during the actual command line installation that you will need the WS context string. When you created the Proxy Connect endpoint, or I'm sorry, the Direct Connect endpoint, it asked you to enter the WS context right then and there. It's a little bit different when deploying and installing a Proxy Connect endpoint. Again, the WS context information is located in the endpoint installation guide. It very clearly tells you where to find that info and what the exact command used to install the endpoints are. I'm not going to go over the actual installation, I just wanted to show you the creation of the endpoint packages. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video was helpful.